Welcome to Beneath the Surface, the podcast that proudly lives local, with host, realtor, and investor Andy Algreen. And now, time for the show.
What's up, everybody? My name's Andy Algreen, realtor and investor here in Monroe, Iowa, and Central Iowa, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Surface podcast, where I just bring people on and have conversations with local business owners here in Monroe or Central Iowa. So today we have on Jon Dunwell, who is the pastor at Gateway Church here in Monroe.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I appreciate you hopping on and just having a conversation.
Good to be here.
I guess we'll first just start out with, how long have you been at pastoring at Gateway, and like how did Gateway find you?
Yeah, actually, I had some relationship with some folks who attended Gateway through other contexts, and they approached me, and I began doing services there right around November. And so it's just been, a number of months at the close of the year out and then into the start of this year, and it's been a great experience.
Awesome. So I guess, how long have you been a pastor? What's your background kind of look like in that aspect?
Absolutely. So I pastored in Shakopee, Minnesota. I planted a church called Riverside Community Church as an assistant pastor with another pastor. And while I was going to school, I worked there 4.5 years. And then in 1990, after Christy and I, my wife, we got married, we took a position as an assistant pastor in Orlando, Florida, at a church called, at that time, Westwood Chapel. And a few years later, 4 years later, our lead pastor left, and so the church called me to become the lead pastor of, at that time, we renamed it to Westwood Church. And I was there 21 years. And so pastored there in probably the largest underserved community in Orlando, Florida, a part of Orlando called Pine Hills that was nicknamed Crime Hills. And so it was an interesting ministry experience. Absolutely loved it, and developed lifelong friendships and relationships that have been so impactful in my life. And then the last number of years, I always had a passion to get involved in coaching and consulting, primarily with nonprofits and churches, but also businesses. And so I wanted some business experience. And so for a little over a decade, the plan was a decade, it ended up being a couple years longer. I wanted to work in the business world and volunteer in the nonprofit world and ministry. And so for a little over 10 years, almost 12 years, I guess I'd say, I worked in the financial services industry, working for two national national investment firms, and then as a vice president, and then for 10 years, and then 2 years, I was in my own financial services business. And now I'm 100% back in the nonprofit world. So Gateway Church is a great challenge for me. I love getting to know the community. I love being able to engage in ministry, and then I also do some other nonprofit work in the greater Des Moines, Iowa area. Yep.
How does your ministry work differ from like the church that was in Minnesota to the one that was in Florida to Gateway? Like, how do those churches kind of?
Well, everything is different. When you look at, Minnesota was a church plant. In Orlando, it was a struggling church in a struggling community. And so what makes every church different is when God pulls a group of people together, it's almost like a personality. And so you have to get to know that personality, and you have to know, why has God formed that group of people? Why has he brought them together? And how is he calling us to utilize what he's called together to fulfill his mission? And so you always have these basic principles that kind of guide your ministry, because you have a philosophy of ministry. We have a biblical context that guides us and directs us. But we also put that in context, which I call a vision of who we are, because the community in Shakopee, Minnesota is dramatically different than Orlando, Florida, which is dramatically different than the greater, if I can say it, Monroe, Iowa area. Yeah. And so you're always adapting to where you find yourself and who God has gathered together, and trying to figure out how to utilize these resources that God has made available to you.
Mm-hmm. what are those like basic principles?
So basic principles,
Yeah.
So to some degree, the basic principles I bring to almost any ministry experience is, first off, is kind of this mission that God's given us. And so as in the church work, you look at what God has said about why a church exists, what we are supposed to be doing. And so one of the things is a simple mission that came up with Youth for Christ, used it long years ago, is to know God and to make him known. We really exist to help people know God and make him known. That's for our own personal journey and then our impact upon the world. But the other things that I think are important is really kind of a little bit expanding that out to say that ultimately I believe we're called to experience God. And I'm to help people through the Word of God and through a relation with him be able to enjoy all that God has in store for them. And there's three things that we do. Is first off, we call it relevant worship. And relevant worship isn't necessarily about the music and the worship on Sunday morning. It's far more about, how does the Word of God impact you in the everyday? How can I take Andy and how can Andy and Jon learn that these are the principles and the truths that God's Word teaches, and we have, as followers of Christ, the Spirit of God living inside of us? What does that look like now to live in the world in which we find ourselves? Not just the confines of Sunday morning, but in the Monday through Saturday as well. Then discovering a place to belong. And that really is about connection. That, it's a hard world out there. And part of what God utilizes, if you look through the scriptures, is community, connection, relationship. And we have a connection and a relationship with him, but he also calls us to have a connection and relationship with each other. And so we really try to work hard to make Gateway Church Monroe, or Riverside Community Church in Shakopee, or Westwood Church in Orlando, Florida, a place where everyone knows your name from the old Cheers, if you're too young to remember that, Andy. But everyone knows your name. Everyone knows your story. And you have a group of people that you can brag with without calling it bragging. And you have a group of people that you can complain with without calling complaining, because they truly love you and care for you, will be you through the high, low, the good, bad, and the ugly. And then the last thing that we do generally in churches is really kind of helping you choose to make a difference in your world. God has changed us. God has transformed us. But he's given us this mission, not just to know him, but he's given us this mission to make him known. And so we get this unique opportunity to figure out how God has uniquely made each of us to go out into our world and make an impact through loving others just as Christ has loved us, through serving and what we call in the church washing feet, to figure out how God has uniquely equipped us to make a difference in our world. Sometimes that's in active church ministry, and sometimes it's what we do in the community, and how we live our lives and how we impact our neighbors. And so it's to experience God through relevant worship, discovering a place to belong, and choosing to make a difference. And so those are the transferable big picture ideas that we're always doing. Now, that looks a little bit different, in Shakopee, Minnesota, as it will look different in Orlando, Florida, and as it's beginning to look different in Monroe, Iowa, and beyond in terms of that. That answers your question.
Yep, definitely. So then how would you, I feel like there's a lot of different interpretations in how people define what a successful church is and or looks like. I hear a lot about like number of people sometimes defines what a successful church is. From your perspective, what's a successful church?
I think it's really about a church that is experiencing growth, whether we're talking about the people that we reach, but also equally important, how we're creating what the scriptures call disciples or followers. We're in Gateway Church Monroe, we're in the Gospel of Mark, and we're in that 4th and 5th chapter. And what's interesting is, particularly also in the 3rd chapter, we see Jesus gathering these large crowds of people. But we see Jesus retreating from the crowd, where the church today is very concerned about stopping at gathering a crowd and calling that success. Jesus actually took it to another step, and he went out and he called disciples. says he went up on the mountain away from the crowd and chose 12. And we see him investing particularly in those 12. And following that story, there is the parable of the soils. And part of what I think Jesus is communicating to us is, hey, we will have people who are attracted, and they all come with a different heart attitude. But look within that crowd for those people with the right heart attitude, where the seed of the Word of God and the truth of God and the life of God can be planted. And when it falls into good soil, those disciples, those people whose hearts are prepared, he said it's like a mustard seed, this small, insignificant little seed that looks like it amount to nothing. But when it's in that soil, it grows into something unbelievably large and phenomenal. And so the definition of success is the creation of disciples. Because we know that those 12, and there were more, 70 to 120, when Jesus died and rose again, sat in a room huddled together in fear. But when the Holy Spirit fell upon them in Acts, the early church, we saw them explode. I mean, before long, before we get to Acts chapter 8, some would say the church in Jerusalem exploded from a small gathering of maybe 120 people to a gathering of 25,000 people. So yes, it's growth, but it's growth with the right. It's a little bit, not to switch things around and quote an author rather than the Bible, but it's about having the right seats on the bus, the right people on the bus and in the right seats, and the good to great type idea. That Christ kind of follows it. That's a principle comes from, and he did that with the 12 disciples, and they literally turned the world upside down. If you only stop at crowd building and don't go toward making disciples, then I think Jesus says you're throwing seed on rocky soil. You're throwing seed in weed-infested areas. You're throwing seed, in areas that's hard ground where it will not take root. And all you have is a crowd. And that's when you see the church not living out its mission. Mm-hmm. That's when you see the church not being that voice God calls us to be, because you're worried about losing the crowd rather than focusing on making disciples.
Yeah, that's really good. We'll kind of dig into, for those that don't know Jon, he has one eye. And
I put it in before we started this, you know.
Yep. But yeah, kind of just want to dig into that story a little bit. How did that happen? And I guess just a background.
Yeah, so I was pastoring in Orlando, Florida, and I got to tell you, 2000 and 2001 was an interesting time of life for me. So the eye that I have here is a prosthetic. I still have my eye, but what everyone sees is actually a hand-painted lens that's very huge that I put in and out every morning. If I took it out, my eye closes. If I took it out and I pulled my eye open, it would look blind. You would see it as being, okay, he's obviously blind. Gotcha. So in 2000, I was taking a missions trip with a group of people from our church. We've been doing some work in Mexico, and we were working with a group out of Texas, and we were building these churches, helping them build churches, physically the building and facility in some rural villages. We go across in Reynosa and go in 6-8 hours into Mexico and build these churches. And so we're in a rural village. I mean, think about it. We're talking the water is a hose that runs down from a tank, and you may hook into it as a residence. The electricity wasn't it was sometimes a cord running on the ground that came to your house if you had it. I remember lunch being a goat herder walking by, and shortly thereafter we heard the neck get slit, and we had that for lunch. Mm-hmm. That's what it was like in the villages. So we were building a church, and I'm not the handiest guy in the world, and so I was hammering in some trusses with some big old, 16 penny nails, a big nail. I was just kind of hanging goofy like this, and I was hammering away, and I didn't hit that nail squarely, and that nail came back, hit my eye, dropped out. And so I knew I was in trouble. They knew I was in trouble. They loaded me in the back of a truck and then took me all the way to a bigger town. We went from about 4 places trying to find someone. My eye was filled with blood, trying to find someone who could help me. And we finally found this, eye specialist. And I remember we walk in and he's eating a sandwich. he puts the sandwich down, he wipes his hands on his pant leg, and he goes, looks at my eye, and he says, yep, he's got, and I don't speak language, but the people interpreting did, and basically said his eye's full of blood. He's going to need some surgery, and we can't do it here. So they loaded me in the back of a truck and drove me, 8 hours back to across the border in Texas. And just so happened the family we were working with to build these churches in Mexico from Texas, he had detached retina. So he had a retina specialist, and he had an appointment the next day. And so that morning I took his appointment, went in, and an hour later they were getting me prepped for surgery. So I've had 9 surgeries on my left eye. And it has been every surgery fixed something and then caused problems till finally I lost complete sight, and there's nothing more they can do. My eye continues to atrophy. I'm getting smaller and smaller a little bit. At some point they say I'll probably later in life have to have it taken out completely. But right now I wear a prosthetic lens and it props it open, and my eyes track a little bit because the reality is I still have my eyeball.
Gotcha. The
worst part was, and I say 2000, 2001, is that next year in 2001, I was gotten into getting healthy and was riding a bicycle, and still had surgeries coming up on my eye. And believe it or not, I was riding in a study for the safety of bike lanes. And I'm downtown Orlando, driving down Orange Avenue. Hundreds of us have entered into the study. We're grading. We got free T-shirts and all this kind of stuff for doing it, but we're grading the safety of bike lanes. And I had a block truck, a big truck carrying block, ran me over. And I ended up with a compound fracture, so my left arm's a mess too. Good movement, only moves so much, but they put pins and stuff in it. But I spent 7 days in the hospital the next year with 4 operations. My eye doctor actually had to come to the hospital in between surgeries to check on my eye, and they had to cancel surgeries for my eye because I had 4 surgeries on my left arm. So 2000, 2001 were bad years. The funniest thing was when I get back from Mexico with the eye, and I had got stuck there because I couldn't travel because of the pressure on the plane and things like that. And I get back, and I'm actually leading service, and I have this big old eye patch on because I've had surgery. And I go to pray, and I say amen, and I look up, and everyone in the church has an eye patch on, commiserating with my circumstance and situation. So interesting time of life, no doubt.
For sure. So like when you look back, like in the moment, I feel like it's hard to see how God is kind of working, at least for me, like initially. But like now when you look back, kind of like you said before, how someone that you knew had an eye appointment and then you were able to take his spot. Felt like that was kind of part of God kind of working in your life to get that put into place for you there.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Whether we're talking about my eye or we're talking about my accident with my arm, or we're talking the fact that Christy and I were childless for 11 years in a growing church with lots of little kids. Any of those difficult moments, I really have learned, God has taught me through his word and through experience and through other people. I don't sit there and try to figure out, did God cause this? I just know it happened. I like to say, and I don't mean to be vulgar, but in Apopka, Florida, there's these big old pickup trucks, and they wear cowboy hats and cowboy boots. Life's a little slower there. And they have these way off the ground bumpers, but you can see that bumper sticker, and they make the most profound theological statement you can possibly imagine. And it says this, I'm not going to say the word, blank happens. I actually think that describes life. There's a lot of things in life that happen that are just nasty, mean. We live in a fallen, destructive world, and I'm not trying to figure out if God caused it. I know it's within his control. What I try to believe is God will do something with it. And so what I try to do is when something like that happens, I try to move myself to the edge of the seat, my feet on the ground, and I start looking around trying to figure out, what are you going to do with this, God? How are you going to use this? How can you get the glory? How can you somehow do something unusual through this? So sometimes my journey has been an encouragement to other people who are going through an unfair circumstance or situation, or just like my wife being childless. I learned so much by watching her walk through childlessness with joy. Someone who would love to have had 10 children if she could have, but was incapable of because of physical limitations. I learned from that, and I watched, man, that's an encouragement to me. And so it's always about moving myself to the edge of the seat and trying to figure out, okay, God, what are you going to do with this? How are you going to work? How are you going to accomplish your will? How is this going to be used? And I think part of fun of heaven, the reason it's eternity, is God's going to show me the rest of the story. He's going to say, you know what happened down there? And I'm going to go, what? You know, it's kind of a pain and don't really understand what happened there. He's going to go, let me show you the rest of the story. Let me show you how all the other things came together to accomplish something that you had no idea that I accomplished. That'll be the fun of heaven.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Probably should have found someone who talks less.
No, that's good. That's what you're on here for.
That's good.
I guess I'll kind of just go in. So one of the biggest things that I've learned about, so I'm kind of newer to my faith, and one of the bigger things I've learned is that Christianity is more about, kind of like you've been saying, it's more about a relationship.
It is.
It's more so than a religion. So I've been reading, I had a question for you. I've been reading out of the book of Matthew right now, and there's a verse that has been stuck in my head for a while, for like a week. So I thought I might as well just wait to ask you till now.
Oh, great.
It was Matthew 10:16. It says, "Look, I am sending you out as sheep among wolves, so be as shrewd as snakes and as harmless as doves." And then this is out of the NLT version. And so at first I thought shrewd had like a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
I was better at math in school than I was at English. So
yeah.
I read a different version of it, and it says, I don't know which one this was out of, but it says, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves." So, kind of my first couple thoughts when I try to look into that verse, you've kind of taught me first look at the context. So, like, what's around it, what's before it, what's after it. So when I, look at the beginning of that chapter, it's about Jesus sending out his 12 apostles to go do discipleship. And then if you look before that, it goes into, like the Bible talks about, Jesus performing miracles and healing people and stuff like that. And then just before chapter 10 starts, he talks about the need for workers and for disciples. And then it goes into the 12 apostles into that. So then my first thought goes back to, we're called to therefore be as wise as serpents. So I was kind of stuck on that. So then my first thought went to Genesis, the beginning of Genesis, where God said the serpent was the shrewdest of all wild animals, and the serpent caused Eve to sin. So I thought one thing was like acknowledging that, one of my thoughts was just acknowledging that like the devil is like real, and I don't know, it's kind of like a battle, I guess, against that. But that was one of the thoughts I had. But then he also in turn follows it up with like being as harmless as doves, and this is Jesus talking as well. Because obviously the devil is only here to like cause chaos and destruction and then Jesus turns around and says, also be as wise as the serpent, but also be as harmless as a dove. I don't know why. It just stuck in my head, so I just wanted to get your thoughts on it.
I think you have raised some significant points about the world in which we live. So we look at the world, and you don't have to even be a follower of Christ to recognize that there are destructive elements in our world. I mean, people talk about we live in a dog-eat-dog world. We look around the world and we see horrific things that are occurring. We have to have law enforcement. Militaries are necessary. And so whether we're talking in our everyday or we're talking the larger picture of the world, there is this destructive element. And so we have to be wise. We have to realize that when we walk in this world, we take all the wisdom that God gives us and the wisdom that comes from His Word, and we walk into this world aware that there are these travesties, there are these difficulties, there are these harmful things, and we use all this stuff to help us walk through here. But we also realize that even though we're wise and we're navigating this harmful, destructive world in the best way we possibly can, that we're not called to be destructive ourselves, that we're called to exhibit the life of Christ. I mean, I think one of the hardest things today, Andy, is because I'm involved in politics too, and I grieve that everything is like this. You know, everything is contentious, and it's about trying to win, and it's about trying to enforce wills. The primary way in which we minister in this community, the primary way in which we make a difference is through a self-sacrificing manner. The primary way in which we make a difference is through choosing to wash feet. The primary way in which we choose to impact and transform the culture is through choosing to the role of service rather than the role of ruler. And so I sometimes think that people have placed way too much confidence in government or in elections or in, getting the right person in the office and think that's going to solve all the world's problems. It's definitely an important part of it. But so much of what we do requires us to be willing to lay our life down in service to others and love to others. And that's the idea of this gentle as doves and how we interact with the world in which we find ourselves. But it's not just to say we're going to do it for the sake of doing it. We're still wise. We're still using all that intellect that God has given us and that wisdom he's given us to navigate the world. So it's acknowledging that we have this mission that God's given us to love the world as he has loved the world. But we do that with wisdom. We do that with knowledge. We do that with everything God's provided for us in his word to guide us. And so it's a word of wisdom. Like he'll tell his disciples, if you go to a place and they don't want you, be wise. Rust the dust off your feet and go to the next town, because I've told you, the fields are ripe for harvest. So you just got to go out there and find the right places to go. Don't try to beat your head against the wall. Try to convince people who have no interest in being convinced of anything. So he shares things like that with us about how we engage with this world. So,
yep. What's your role in politics?
So I am an assistant majority leader, elected state representative. So I represent most of Jasper County. I actually don't represent Monroe or Prairie City, but I have all the rest of Jasper County in the State House as a state representative in District 38. And then I serve in a leadership role in the House as an assistant majority leader and serve obviously on, 6 or 7 committees. Sometimes I forget how many there are.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. Can you kind of dig into that a little bit more? You talked about it a little bit, but I feel like there, as far as like the division between the people, I guess, I feel like for me personally, I feel like a lot of it is driven by media, and I don't know if I feel it as much when I just talk to people and have conversations every single day and stuff like that, but.
It's interesting. I think one of my colleagues shared in his retirement speech, because we're at the end of session, so those who aren't running again are giving retirement speech. But I think one of my colleagues shared it this year. 93% of our bills have been almost completely bipartisan. 7% have been contentious. Now, on an average year, and we're not done yet, so that number may go up, it's about 15% where there's actually a division between right or left or Republican versus Democrat, but 85% are unanimous virtually or with very little dissent. And that's because whether you're Republican or Democrat, we may disagree sometimes on strategy, but the reality is we often are in agreement on the passion. Like both Republicans and Democrats have a passion and desire to provide good education for our kids. We're trying to figure out how to do that. We have different strategies of how we go about approaching that, different philosophical perspectives that go there. But in terms of motive or intent, we share a unifying factor about that. So when a student asks me about those differences between the two parties, I often will communicate the shared motive or intent, but difference in strategy, rather than this idea of we hate each other in terms of, I agree on national politics, it's far worse, and it certainly comes down in local politics as well. But everything we talk about in politics today is what we call an existential argument. If you don't vote my person in, the world's coming to an end. Mm-hmm. Well, if you keep saying that over and over, and Republicans and Democrats both do that, you are really moving people toward radical responses. Because if the world is truly coming to an end, if so-and-so gets elected, what are you going to do to stop it? And how far are you going to go? And so I think we have to be careful with our rhetoric. There's certainly democracy, and let's just be clear, we're a representative democracy or republic. We have survived President Donald Trump, and we will survive President Joe Biden. Our system has a robustness to it. It has checks and balances. It has a level of accountability. Are there concerns? Yes, because there are extremes. But we as a people have got to make sure that we're telling our elected leaders and engaging with our elected leaders to make sure they stay within the bounds of our Constitution and how we're meant to operate and how we're meant to work. I tell people, every elected official brings all that they are to the position, all that they are to every decision. So what do I bring? My worldview is a Christian worldview. And I have a right to bring that in, just like someone else has a right to bring in a different worldview. Number two, I have a conservative ideology. That doesn't mean Republican ideology. That's different, and we don't have time to go into that. But I also then work with Republicans. And sometimes my greatest fear is sometimes I get fearful of both Democrats and Republicans where their Democrat or Republican ideologies are beginning to overshadow the other two. Because there's a difference. I work with the Republicans, and they share more of my conservative worldview. But I'm not interested in implanting Republican ideology upon people. I just want this conservative principle of freedom. I want you, Andy, to own as many of your rights and as much of your money and as much of your property as you possibly can with little government interference. I believe in the transcendent, that we're all asking hard questions about not just the law, but there's something beyond my feelings that guide us and direct us. For me, that's partly the Word of God, that's our Constitution, etc. I want you, Andy, to realize the power of diversity. I'm not trying to get everyone on the same level. That's called socialism, or more on the extreme areas, communism. I'm trying to give you equal opportunity, that you have an opportunity to pursue the dream. Those are more conservative ideologies than whether you're this or that. And sometimes, even in my ideology, living it out, people don't realize I'm for freedom. So when someone, if the Iowa Capitol has a open policy for putting up displays, I take the First Amendment seriously. And that First Amendment says freedom of religion and freedom of expression. If you're going to open it up, then it's freedom. And I want that freedom, even if I disagree with it. Someone put an abhorrent, evil, wicked display in the Capitol. Regrettably, they have a right to do that. And that's not only from a constitutional perspective, that's also from a biblical perspective. Because Jesus did not force himself on people. He allowed people to respond to his grace and his truth. But so I worry sometimes that Republican ideology can come over and say, well, it's not mine, so therefore it can't be there. No, I believe in freedom, even in stuff that I adamantly disagree with and adamantly believe is evil. And there's bounds to everything, you know that. But generally I want to err on the side of liberality when it comes to freedom. Not the other side of trying to control to my perspective only. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. So I guess kind of get back into conversation about Gateway Church.
Yeah.
What is the church's just 1 year? Do you guys have like a 1 year goal for the church, 5-year goal, or what's kind of your vision?
Well, we're still early for that yet.
Okay.
So part of what we're doing right now is Gateway Church Monroe has been around for a while. It's gone through highs and lows and changes and adjustments. So part of what I'm doing is still gathering a team. Oh, I have ideas, Andy, of what I think we can do, what I see us like us do. But this is not Jon Dunwell's church. This is Christ's church. And I want the community to set some direction. So right now we're building our team. We're looking for not only people who don't know Christ, and that's kind of our sweet spot, trying to help people come to the knowledge of Christ. But I'm also looking for some mature believers who have a passion to be transformational in the Monroe area and who would love to say, I want to come be part of the team. I'm coming to Gateway Church because I see an opportunity to minister, not just be served. I see an opportunity to make an impact, not just be impacted. So we're looking at gathering that team. And I really want that team to spend some time coming up with how God has called us to make a difference. And I don't want it to be Jon Dunwell's idea. I want it to be the community's idea and expression. So our focus right now is just immersing ourselves in the community. We're looking for places to serve and care and to say, you know what? We like Monroe. We like this greater area where God has placed us. And we just want to get to know you and love you and serve you and see how God may be calling you to maybe come join us on this mission. As we meet together, more specifics of that strategy will come forward. But I'm old now, Andy. I'm 57 years old. I see the dangers of some pastor just popping in and saying, hey, I've got it all figured out. You come join me. And it doesn't become the mission and the passion and the vision of the people. And so that's where we find ourselves. So we're looking. I mean, if you are someone out there who says, you know what? I think God's called me to ministry. And I want to get involved in some place where not only I experience God, not only where, I get an opportunity to be loved by other people, but I really want to be part of that team that God's going to use in a unique way to do something transformational in Monroe and the greater area around us.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Awesome. Good deal. So I guess just to kind of wrap things up for the people listening, if you had to give just one piece of advice about faith, family, business, or whatever, what have you, what would that piece of advice be? And how can people reach Gateway Church or reach you? Or
Yeah, absolutely. So one piece of advice, it's very hard to narrow that down. But I would say this: the older I get, the more much I value how much God uses other people. Get involved, get engaged in a church. You're going to see their imperfections. They're going to step on your toes. You're going to step on their toes. But it is in that context of community that God works. And so if you want to watch God work in your life, get involved, get engaged, risk. Let people step on your toes and learn about giving and receiving grace and forgiveness and those types of things, because it's a whole lot harder outside the church than inside the church. So that would be my advice. I think we're living in a world where we're moving away from connecting with other people. We're becoming more isolated. I think there's going to be some damaging things with that. So that would be my advice today. Tomorrow may be a little bit different. Yep. Gateway Church, check us out on Facebook. Look up Gateway Church Monroe. I always use Gateway Church Monroe. I like it for some reason. I like the Monroe on the back of it. Go to gatewaychurchmonroe.com. Or you can reach out to me. I have a unique email address because I wear a bow tie, and I've worn them for 30 years. So my email address is thebowtie84. It's the year I graduated high school, @gmail.com. Or you can reach me at 515-325-7001. That's 515, that's not like a commercial, 325-7001. But no, we'd love to connect with you. You're going to see me around town. Session at the house is ending, and so I'll be hanging out here a bit more in Monroe and getting a chance to continue to engage in the community. I love what I see. I love what I'm experiencing here, and I love Gateway Church Monroe.
Awesome. I appreciate you jumping on and having a conversation.
Well, it's good. You need to find someone who can talk a little more.
Yeah, I know.
I got the gift of gab, don't I?
No, that's good. That's good. That's what
All right.
Need.
Well, I appreciate you being here, Andy. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us Beneath the Surface. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe for future episodes.